But I do want to thank our worship team again for leading us this morning, and particularly Mallory for just opening up and being so vulnerable to share with us her struggle and what that song meant to her. And so, because that goes along with what we're talking about for the next 5 weeks, we're going to talk about this guy named Job. And we're starting a series this morning called Struggle is Real, and what God teaches us as we go through suffering. And so we're in Job chapter 1, if you want to take your Bibles and go there to Job chapter 1. It's right before the book of Psalms. And as you're turning there, I want to ask you this question as we begin. What's your breaking point? In life, what's your breaking point? You know, you often hear people talk about, and you may have said before, you know, I've just got so much going on in my life, so many trials, so many hardships, so many struggles. What is your too much? You know, you hear people say, unfortunately, it's not right, it's not accurate, that God never gives you too much to handle. But what is your too much to handle? But what's your breaking point? And as we kind of move along from that, at what point do you throw in the towel? At what point do you throw in the towel with relationships, with people, with jobs, with things? When things get too hard, at what point do you quit? At what point do you throw in the towel? Now, what about your kids? Sometimes your kids can give you a little bit more than you can handle, especially as they grow up. And kids can keep you up all night. You're worried about where they are. You're thinking about them. You're praying for them. But if you're a parent and you're going through this struggle with your kids, most of you would agree with me that your relationship with your kids is not based on what they do for you. They can hurt you over and over and over and over again, but you're still going to love them. Now, that's not true of most other people. You know, if you're like friends or your boss or something like that, a lot of times we just throw in the towel. But you never give up on your kids. But unfortunately, we have that kind of relationship with God so many times. That God's going to keep blessing me, and He's going to be good to me, and things are going to be nice and rosy and peachy and good and all this stuff. But then when things begin to get a little bit tougher, and when life begins to take a sudden turn for the worse, we begin to see God not doing so much for us at that moment. We can back off a little bit, and our relationship with God begins to cool off because we're not seeing the good as much as we used to. And so this morning, as we begin this series in Job, this question, what is your breaking point, begins, or really serves as the narrative for the life story of this guy named Job. And so this morning, let's start in verse 1 of chapter 1. We're going to read a few verses. It says in verse 1, we're introduced to this man. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Before we even get into really the meat of this text this morning, the meat of the message, the author, whoever wrote Job, thinks it's pretty important that we understand, we get a good picture of who this guy is. He introduces us right off to the bat to this man named Job. He tells us 2 things about Job. First of all, Job was a good man. Job was a good man. The Bible says there in verse 1, he was blameless. That doesn't mean he was sinless, but it means that when he did sin, he recognized that. He got that right with God, and he got it right with others. He was a good man. He was blameless. He was upright. It says that he worshiped and he feared and he obeyed God. He even ministered to his family as his children would have these parties with each other. It says that he would worship on their behalf in case maybe one of them had sinned against God, and he was mediating for his family. This was a good and righteous man. But not only was he a good man, he was a great man in the sense that God had blessed him tremendously, abundantly. It said that he had 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. He also had 11,000 head of livestock. He had thousands of cows. He had thousands of horses and sheep and all this stuff. He was a great, wealthy man. He also had hundreds, if not thousands, of servants. He was abundantly blessed in that area. He owned much stuff. God had richly blessed him. In fact, it said in verse 3 that he was the greatest man in the East. Now, in this culture, they didn't have a West, right? They didn't know about America and all that. So the East was their world. What the author is telling us is this man was the greatest man in the whole world. He was a good man, and he was a great man. It's like a Disney movie. Everybody that's good, they come out on top. It's life as it should be. He's blessed by God. He's worshiping God. Even if in Disney movies, if it takes a turn for the worse, it always comes around to the good in the end. This guy is like every Disney movie character at his best. Good man, great man, on top, living life as it should be. Everything is right in the world. Skip to verse 13. Let's start reading. Now there was a day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job who said the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them. And the Sabians, this is a group of really a gang of very violent people. The Sabians fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was speaking, there came another who said the fire of God, literally lightning, fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was speaking, somebody else came and said the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And then another one came while he was still speaking and said, Job, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people. And Job, your children are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And then Job rose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshiped. You just got news. Everything you own is now gone. Even worse than that, your 10 children have now been killed, violently crushed under the weight of a house. What's your reaction? Job fell on the ground and worshiped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord took away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And then flip over to chapter 2. Beginning in verse 7, Satan goes out from the presence of the Lord. Look what it says. He struck Job with loathsome sores, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself. It's kind of graphic. This is where he was. He sat in the ashes. And his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? You still going to be a good man, Job? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? All this, Job did not sin with his lips. When you read this, the question I have for you is, how can we not just stop and weep with Job? This is a man whose life has just completely been devastated. This is a man who's just lost every single thing that belonged to him, including his children and including his health. How can we not just stop and weep with this man? He just received the worst news, the news that no parent ever wants to hear. And now some of you, if you've got your Bibles open or you're familiar with the story of Job, you're probably asking, wait a minute, wait. You skipped a big section there. Like you skipped verses 6 through 12. Why on earth would you skip? Because this is why I did that. We're going to come back to that in just a second. But I wanted us to see and experience what Job did as he went through it. I wanted us to kind of bring ourselves down to his level for a moment and see it through his eyes and see life just completely unraveling, falling apart all around him. And the truth of the matter is, none of us have ever gone through anything like this, but every one of us at some point or another has gone through suffering. We've experienced suffering. Our worlds have changed just like that. You've stood over the grave of a loved one, wondering, God, Why didn't you heal him? You stood over the grave of a dead marriage. You stood over the grave of a dead job when you got that phone call that said, hey, we can't afford to keep you anymore. Today's your last day. You stood over the grave of suffering. Every single one of us, but none of us have experienced like Job, but this suffering is something that all of us at some point in our life experience, trials and hardships. And when we're like Job, when we're right in the middle of our world collapsing, all we can see is life unraveling around us. And it raises the question that humans have struggled with for centuries. Why do bad things happen to good people? This is a good man. This is a great man. We want to know why. When we go through things like this, we demand answers. Let's be honest. We go to God. God, why? God, where were you? God, what are you thinking? And you can imagine Job had to have been asking the same questions. God, really? I mean, take my cattle, but my kids. Take my servants, but my children. Take things, but God, why? Where are you? We demand answers. We want answers to these questions. They're valid questions. But see, what we have is something that's actually going on behind the scenes. And it's just why we skip this little section, verses 6 through 12, because something was happening that Job was completely unaware of. Something bigger, something greater, and we don't know how long Job was unaware of it. But there was something happening. God pulls the curtain back a little bit for us. And we get to see something. Thankfully, in His grace, God did this because He wants us to understand. There's something bigger. There's something greater going on here. So verse 6, let's go back to that and see what Job didn't know at the time. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, from walking up and down on it." He sounds like a teenage boy. What you been doing? Oh, just walking. In verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? That there's none like him on all the earth, a blameless man, an upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." And Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand, God. Stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. I guarantee it, God. You try him." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And again, in chapter 2, the sons of God were presenting themselves, and Satan comes back after he has taken everything away from Job. And God says, don't kill him, but you can affect his health, but don't kill him. And we saw that Job had sores, and really the last thing he had left, his health, was taken away from him. So why? There's something I think that the author of this wants us to know, that God ultimately wants us to know. He sets the stage for the whole book of Job in verses 6 through 12. If you're taking notes this morning, if you have a bulletin, we've got a blank space on the back. I want you to write this down because I don't ever want you to forget this. I want you to plant this in your heart. And it's this. The one thing that I can be absolutely, positively, without a doubt, sure of is that when my world is crumbling, when my world is falling apart, God is still on his throne and is completely and totally in control. The one thing that I can be absolutely, positively, without a doubt, sure of is that when my world is falling apart, when my world is unraveling, God is still on his throne and is completely and totally in control. There's a word that theologians have come up with. If you took this whole definition and dropped it into one word, it's the word sovereignty. God is sovereign. He is on his throne. The throne is the place, the highest place of authority and power in all of the universe. And God the Father has never been removed from it, and he ain't going anywhere. God is sovereign, completely and totally in control. I think it's important as we set the stage here in understanding this, that he's sovereign over a few different things that the author tells us about. First of all, God is sovereign over every square inch, every molecule, and every aspect of this universe. He is in control. Look what it says in verse 1. He talks about the sons of God coming to present themselves before the Lord. Now, who are the sons of God? This isn't like a bunch of little Jesuses running around. These are angelic beings, spirit beings that God has created. And one author describes it, and he says that presenting themselves before, what this means is they are attending a meeting to which they are summoned, or in more specific terms, they are coming before a superior to do his will. They are answering to the one who is on the throne. They are coming before the throne of God as an inferior before a superior, to give an account for, to answer for, to receive his will. This is just like President Obama addressing his cabinet, calling his cabinet together, saying, Secretary of Defense, tell me what you got going on. Secretary of the Treasury, tell me what's going on. These are inferiors coming before a superior. He is the king of the universe. He governs the universe. Christopher Ashe explains the role of these spirit beings, these angelic beings, and he says that God governs the world by the means of and through the agency of a multiplicity of supernatural powers, some of whom are evil. That is to say that the sons of God that he talks about here, presenting themselves before the Lord, the sons of God represent powers that are greater than human powers and yet are less than God's powers. They include among their number the Satan and his lying and evil spirits. Did you know, and listen, don't have this in your mind, that God and Satan are like on the same level and they're just duking it out. And Satan's like, yeah, watch this, God, I'm going to knock that person out. And God's like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to knock you out. You know, they're not inferior. God is sovereignly over control, and he is the God of Satan himself. He is king over Satan himself. Don't ever, ever forget that. Yes, Satan is violently, maliciously opposed to God and his glory, but listen to me, the second thing is that God is sovereign over Satan himself. Satan, listen, when we are suffering like Job was suffering, it seems to us in our trial, in the midst of it, it seems like God is the one on the leash and that Satan is running rampant. Have you ever felt like that? Okay, God, where are you? Where are you, God? It would be nice. Oh, he must be tied up in the corner. Satan must have got the best of him this time. And Satan's just going buck wild through our life. No, listen to me. The title of this morning's message is Satan on a Leash. And the point that I want you to understand is that Satan's not just on a leash, but God is holding the leash. That is the sovereignty and the power of our God, who is powerful and sovereign over Satan himself. Satan cannot move, cannot breathe, and cannot exist without God's permission. Martin Luther, the great reformer, called Satan God's Satan. Now that doesn't mean that God and Satan are in cahoots together and they're, God's like partnering with you. No. What he's saying is that Satan himself cannot exist without the allowance of God, without the power and authority of God. Which leads us to the fact that God is sovereign over our life. He's sovereign over your life. As you just read here, Satan cannot even touch a hair on the back of a camel that Job owns without God's permission. He can't do anything without God's permission. Satan has done what he is told, no more, no less. That ought to give you some freedom right there. That God is sovereignly and totally in control. But to our eyes, I read this. I don't know if you read this. Maybe this was your first time to read this or first time in a while. But I read this and I go, what the heck are you doing, God? God just threw Job to the wolf. I mean, I read this the other day, and I've read this a million times, but I was reading it again and again and again and again. I said, God, are you out of your sovereign mind? What are you thinking? Like, I don't like the fact that any time God could go, hey, Satan, watch Atkins, go get him. No! Why would you do that, God? What's going on? Something much deeper is happening here. Something much, much deeper and far greater. than Job is happening here. Look at verse 9. Satan begins to accuse Job. In fact, Satan is not his name. It's a title. The title is the Satan. In the Hebrew, it calls him the Satan, and that means the accuser, the enemy. And so the Satan is coming before God in verse 9, and he says, does Job fear God for no reason? I mean, God, you put a hedge of protection around him and his house and all that he owns. You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased because of you. Stretch out your hand, touch everything he owns, and he will curse you. Do you see what Satan is doing here? Oh, this is slick right here. Satan is not opposed to Job. Who is Satan opposed to? God. And the glory of God. That's what got him in trouble in heaven in the first place. So ultimately, what Satan is saying here is, hey, God, I know you think a lot of this guy Job, who's down here, is a good man, a great man. But the only reason he worships you, fears you, the only reason he honors you is because you've blessed him. God, Job does not worship you because you're of your glory. Job doesn't worship you because you're worth it and because you're worthy. He doesn't worship you because you're king. He worships you because you've given him a fat wallet. He worships you because he's got great kids. He honors you because he's got a great marriage, a great sex life, all that stuff. And you've built a hedge of protection on him. He lives a sheltered life. God, I guarantee you he is only good because you've made him great. In fact, God, all these people down here worshiping you, they only care about what you give them, not who you are. So God, I dare you, trust me. Trust me, God. You touch him and he'll curse you. You'll see what you're really like. You'll see who you really got. He doesn't love you for who you are, just for the way you're treating his life. Boom. When all of a sudden this becomes less about Job and more about the glory of God. Listen to me. What is at stake here is the glory of God. What is at stake here is the glory of God. Ultimately, the well-being of the universe depends on the glory of God. A universe in which God is not ultimately glorified is a universe at odds with each other. If God is not the most glorious, worthy being in all of the universe, worthy of worship and acceptance and glory and honor and praise, then he ceases to be God. Because if something else is worship, then that person or that thing is claiming to be God. God is all glorious. He is holy. He is majestic. His glory alone is worthy of being worshiped and honored and praised. And Satan says, God, how are we going to know what this cat Job is really worshiping unless we take it away from him? And we don't like the idea of God saying, okay, do it. Take it. Do it. Did you realize that? I mean, I don't know if you knew this or not, but God knows everything. He's not really taking a risk here. He's not sitting up there going, okay, Job, please. But God knew the heart of Job so deeply, so intimately, that God was willing to stake his reputation on Job. Now let me ask you this question. God knows your heart. You know your heart. Would God be willing to stake his reputation on you? Would God be willing to stake his reputation on you? I can take everything away from this person, and I know that they will still worship me and honor me and live for my glory. If everything was taken away from you, would this be true? You see, although evil and malicious, Satan is doing something that is necessary for the glory of God. Satan doesn't care about, he doesn't want God to receive glory, but God's like, yeah, you just watch, it's going to turn against you. Satan is doing something necessary for the glory of God. In some deep way, it is necessary. It is necessary for it to be seen publicly by the whole universe that God is worthy of worship of men and that God's worth is in no way dependent on God's gifts. Job was the greatest man in the world. His friends, his family, the entire world is now watching this man's life fall apart, and they're watching. What's he going to do? What's he going to do? The world is watching you and me as children of God. When we go through seasons of suffering and struggle, listen to what Peter wrote to New Testament Christians. 1 Peter chapter 1. He says, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of God." As a child of God, as a Christian, what if all of the trials and sufferings you experience have a point? What if it is your opportunity? What if it is your opportunity, your faith being tested, to see who you really treasure, who you really worship, to get you down to the bare essence of your relationship with God and say, "God, thank you for blessing me. But even if you," as Job said in Job chapter 3 verse 15, "even if you slay me, I will still praise you. I will still praise you." You know, a lot of times when I preach a message, I start out with the main idea of the text and then just kind of elaborate on that. But I couldn't do that today. I couldn't do that today because I didn't feel like we were ready. We would be ready at the very outset of this message to deal with this. But here's what I want you to understand this morning. That the glory of God is more important than my comfort. The glory of God is more important than my comfort. See, I don't like this because when I'm suffering, I want vindication. I want answers. I want God to swoop in, rescue me, fix everything immediately. But sometimes heaven is silent for a period. The glory of God is more important than my suffering. In the good times, oh, that's easy to say in the good times, right? When everything's going right, all my bills are paid, my family's healthy, I got everything going on, my marriage is great. Oh, God be praised. And then I'm left in the ash heap, scraping the wounds that God has left me with. Am I still saying, "God be praised"? That's the question. It's easy. Oh man, it's easy to praise God in the good times. But is the glory of God more important than your suffering? Listen, when church attendance drops 8 to 10% just because it rains outside, and when our even just our public coming to worship God is dictated by how we feel, by things we've got going on. Listen, when we let things dictate whether or not we will show up and do something as simple as worshiping God with His people, do you really think we're going to worship when we go through suffering? We cannot honestly say that the glory of God is our highest priority and joy when we let things determine whether or not we even just come to church. I'm going through a season right now. Listen, will you really be able to worship God with your life when life begins to unravel? This week in Jacksonville, I heard a guy who has this really long Korean name, but he was like, "You just call me Charlie." Charlie comes, I don't know how he got Charlie out of his Young Soo, whatever. But Charlie is a pastor, a Korean pastor in Washington, D.C. And for the last several years, he's traveled to China. And what he does is he goes with a team and they meet Christians from North Korea who escape over the river, who are preaching the gospel in North Korea. I don't know if you've read the news lately, but North Korea is kind of anti-Jesus. So they're preaching the gospel in North Korea. They're coming across a river. They're meeting Charlie and a team of missionaries. Charlie and his team, they minister to these men who come across, said they're skinny as a rail. They're enduring suffering and torture and persecution. He said, we feed them. We clothe them. We give them a place to rest for a few days. He said we minister to them. We pray over them. We just cry over them. He said, and then what we do is we give them money to take back to their families. He said what they do is they wad that money up really tightly. They wrap it in a plastic bag and they swallow it. He said, then they go across that river. And before they go across that river, we look at them. And he said, I've said to every one of them, are you ready to die for Jesus? And they say to me, if we die for Jesus, that is the highest privilege of our life. They go across the river. That money does what it does in the human body. They feed their family with it. He said there's a couple of guys that he hasn't seen for 15 years. 2 guys that he's been praying for. He goes every year. He said, I haven't seen them in 15 years. But I know this. If they're alive, they're preaching the gospel. If they're dead, they died preaching the gospel. The glory of God is more important than my comfort. The glory of God is more important than my comfort. And it hit me when he was telling that story. I thought, when I get to heaven, I'm not even going to be worthy enough to walk in their shadows. Because my comfort many times is more important than the glory of God. But what Job is teaching us, what God is teaching us here, is that his glory surpasses anything we could ever go through. That Satan is not just running rampant through our lives, but there is a purpose, a plan. That God is sovereign and Satan is on a leash and God has him on that leash. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. God works all things out for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes, even when heaven is silent. You know, Job is a man who was blameless, who experienced more suffering than any other human being. But his life in the scriptures is pointing to one who's even greater, who would leave heaven, who would take on flesh, who would experience suffering beyond even Job. And he would do it for you. And he would do it for me. Yes, because he loves us. But I'm going to contradict a famous song. You know, when he was on the cross, he thought of me above all. No. He was thinking about me, I'm sure. But Jesus was more concerned about the glory of his Father. Why do you think he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane? I don't want to have to die on the cross, but if you want it, Father, then your will, not mine. Jesus taught more about the glory of the Father than just about anything else. He went to the cross for the glory of God, knowing that the glory of God was more important than his comfort. And that you and I can see suffering now in light of the cross, that there is resurrection. That God's not finished with your story, that his glory will shine. God is not just glorified. Listen to me, God is not just glorified in suffering. He is glorified as well in resurrection and redemption and healing. Are you seeking that this morning? If you're lost, if you've never given your life to Jesus, maybe you're going through suffering and you're like, man, there's no hope. What's the point of this? Let me just tell you something. Jesus suffered for us. He came to give you life. You can find hope. You can find assurance if you just give your life to Jesus. Let him walk with you. Let him have a relationship with you. He'll give meaning and purpose to your life. Would you bow your heads with me?